Welcome to Prescribed by Dr. Nathan Goodyear, where integrative oncology meets holistic healing. This podcast is your home for the latest in innovation, exploration, and elevation in all areas of integrative oncology, medicine, health, wellness, and beyond. Join me and a host of other innovators as we go from practicing to prescribing. Your daily dose of wellness begins now. Welcome to another Prescribed by Dr. Nathan Goodyear podcast. Toxins. What if they were the generational curse that really pushed the envelope, accelerated the trend of obesity, and then this push the manifestation through disease? Now, toxins are not really delineating where they're coming from. So there's two words here I want to talk about: toxins and toxicants. Toxins are actually things that our own body can produce. Hormone metabolites can be toxins. 4-hydroxyestrone is a toxin. But a toxicant is something that is made and produced outside the body that we can then, I don't want to say consume, but take in. We can inhale it. It can come through our skin. We can eat it. Food source is the common source there. An interesting article came out looking at 3 toxicants, again, in the environment. Vinclozolin, had to look at that to spell it, vinclozolin, dioxin, and bisphenol A or BPA. These are 3 toxicants. And they were looking at these in this study, and they were evaluating its connection to obesity and disease. And they actually described its relationship with obesity and disease in a epigenetic transgenerational inheritance pattern. You know, I've talked a lot about Seth Godin and his couple quotes. One is, what education does well is teach us how to collect dots. What they don't do well is teach us how to connect the dots. So what we're going to do here is actually collect these dots and then connect these dots and really try to connect them from these toxicants to obesity, then to cancer, and honestly for disease for that matter, beyond that. So what is this term epigenetic transgenerational inheritance? Well, let's break this up just a little bit. Epigenetics, this word literally is two words, epigenetics. It means above genetics. It is the expression of genetics. Here we're talking about the genome. We're talking about our genetic code, DNA. When you look at the process of how DNA becomes protein, it's DNA transcribed into RNA, RNA translated into protein. That's how this signaling gets manifested. So epigenetics means the above genetics, the expression of our genetics. That could be in the RNA, in the protein, etc. Now, epigenetics is one context within the entire what's called multi-omics emerging field. Epigenetics, transcript, which is genomics, epigenomics, transcriptomics, proteomics, metabolomics, immunomodulomics, hormonomics, and microbiomics. So here we're talking about a multitude of studies of fields. That's what omics means. And epigenomics means the study of epigenetics. So these are the growing fields that you're going to hear a lot about as it relates to cancer, but more specifically, precision cancer care. So when you look at a lot of the advanced testing that we have now available in cancer, where we look at genetic mutations within the cancer, that's genomics. That's genomic studies. And those are tools that we can use to be precise and targeted in our therapy. And we equally have that in epigenetics. Transgenerational means basically it's shared between generations. There's intragenerational, obviously that's within the generation, and then transgeneration is across generation. So what they're doing here is they're saying, well, there is a epigenetic transgenerational inheritance. They're saying that there is a change of genetic expression that becomes inheritable. Classically, it's not, across generations. That's what they're saying here. And when you think about that, that's fascinating, because the long-standing theory was that epigenetics or the change of genetic expression is not inheritable. It's not something we can pass on to our kids. But it really blows the mind because if you think about it, if you don't sleep well, that changes your genetic expression. Well, heck, that could affect your genetic expression that you eventually pass on to your kids. And it really puts into light the preparation before you conceive, but then also how you take care of your body through pregnancy. Because all of these experiences, whether it be diet, sleep, stress, whatever, take your pick, they affect our genetic expression. And they in turn would affect that unborn child and change their genetic expression. Because now studies are showing, again, indeed, it is inheritable. But I want to always tie this to cancer because, of course, I love taking care of patients with cancer. They just inspire me. They're the strongest people I know. There's a couple studies out there that look at epigenetic transgenerational inheritance, and they added in a pathology. Okay. And one such study was from 2022, and the title, Examination of Generational Impacts of Adolescent Chemotherapy, Ifosfamide, and Potential for Epigenetic Transgenerational Inheritance. Now, what they showed here in this study was that chemotherapy promotes epigenetic transgenerational inheritance, not just making these genetic expressions inheritable, but they actually were causing disease in additional generations, transgenerationally. And that was 2022 in a journal of Science. And one of their conclusions was that cancer chemotherapy treatment needs to be considered for later life and generational impacts. We can insert transgenerational impacts. So if you're undergoing treatment for cancer, surgery, chemo, radiation, yes, it's intragenerational, but it's also intergenerational, transgenerational, intra and transgenerational. Got that right. Spit that out 3 times. But there was a 2010 study that was very interesting, and it really showed the length of this legacy impact. And it was a study of mice, single intraperitoneal injection of a common therapeutic, doxorubicin, called the Red Devil. And they wanted to investigate the long-term impacts on female treated mice. And that they found in these mice, the study showed the effects of this transgenerational impact were the most prominent in the 4th to 6th generation. So we're talking here about 1 dose of ifosfamide, chemotherapeutic, intraperitoneal, not just affecting that generation, but affecting their children, their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren, their great-great-grandchildren, even their great-great-great-grandchildren and beyond. So it's a legacy that has massive legs. And that's looking at cancer. Here we're talking about these toxins because when we look at the elevation and the trend of disease, Bobby Kennedy talks about, we need to make America healthy again. Well, why are we not healthy? Well, a lot of it's because of our environment that we're being exposed to. We're products of our environment. And a lot of these products of our environment are toxicants. So let's look at these 3 individual toxicants, and then we'll go through the mechanism. First is vinclozolin. It's a fungicide, so they put it on, plants to make sure that fungi don't grow on it. It's an endocrine disruptor, which means it has hormonal-like activity, and it disrupts hormones. It disrupts hormone balance. Very specifically, it blocks androgen receptors. Androgens are the collective broad spectrum name for male hormones, testosterone, DHT, which is dihydrotestosterone, androstenediol, DHEA. These are all male hormones. But here, vinclozolin blocks androgen receptors, which has a significant impact on metabolism and reproductive health. And what they've shown is that in these mice that were treated with the vinclozolin, this was actually human, in the vinclozolin, what they found is that there was specific epigenetic changes, altered DNA methylation, and histone modifications that became inheritable. But it was in that F0 generation, and then that was transferred across the oncoming generations. So you took something that is fixed, genetic code. You altered the genetic expression above genetics. And then you took something that expression that we thought was not inheritable and now make it inheritable to change the gene expression of the offspring, but beginning in those that are exposed to vinclozolin, a fungicide. Interesting. Next is dioxin. It's an immune system modulator. It's an unintended consequence, if you will, of combustion. Let me go through you some of the sources here, looking at the industrial process sourcing. Again, it's a byproduct of that. Incineration, looking at waste material, particularly a lot of hospital waste material, trash. That's where that can come from. Chemical manufacturing, such as from chlorinated chemicals like PCBs, chlorinated phenols, and pesticides. These can all result in the creation of dioxins. Smelting, metal smelting and refining can produce dioxins as a byproduct. But it's not just all industrial. It can also be natural. Forest fires, volcanoes. A good friend of mine is down in Mexico, and they're near a volcano, and every now and then they send me pictures of this volcano with just, ashes going up in the air. And it's like, run away, run away. But so natural processes can be sources of dioxins. Again, forest fires, volcanoes. Vehicles, exhaust from cars, trucks, etc., can all release dioxins into the air. Wood burning. And so when you think about it, forest fires, wood burning, that makes sense. This is why, home ventilation is so important and having your chimney, adequately maintained. Bleaching paper products. Spent a long time in northern Louisiana, and there was a smell that would really crop up certain times of the year, and it was the paper mills. It smelled awful. But that is another source of these dioxins. Now, the major way that we as humans get exposed to dioxins is actually through our food supplies. And they really get into the food chain, if you will, through meats, dairy, fish, and shellfish. They get stored in the fat tissue and they accumulate, again, within the food chain, and then we consume that. Dioxin is highly toxic, and it's persistent in the environment, and it bioaccumulates, which means it doesn't get broken down. And so it's going to be something that through our life, we're going to get bioaccumulation within us and in our fat tissue. And what this does is this negatively impacts the immune system and, of course, also metabolism, because it's really hard to intertwine those. Similar to the vinclozolin, looking at dioxin exposure in the parental generation, that's F0 in the scientific, this triggers epigenetic alterations linked to immune response, inflammation, and metabolic processes that in the same manner as vinclozolin subsequently became transgenerational, inheritable. And this led to the same dysfunction in body weight, fat storage, inflammation, increasing the risk of obesity in the descendants from this exposure of dioxin. Again, bioaccumulation both in the environment and in the individuals exposed. The third toxicant here is bisphenol A or BPA and its impact on metabolic reprogramming. BPA, it's a plasticizer. It too, like vinclozolin, is an endocrine disruptor. Here, instead of blocking the androgen receptor, which is going to have a huge negative impact on men where we're having a crisis anyways of low testosterone and sperm count, but back to BPA, it mimics estrogen. So it acts like estrogen, so it's going to bind to estrogen. It's going to stimulate the same similar pathways that estrogen will. A lot of people talk about estrogen dominance where you have high estrogen production, low progesterone, and this creates a plethora of metabolic issues, hormonal issues that women often struggle with, especially through perimenopause and postmenopausal stages of life. But when obesity is present or overweight is present, that's a big issue as well in terms of estrogen dominance. The sources of BPA is primarily chemicals in the environment, food, beverage containers, polycarbonate plastics, water bottles, and other containers. Other products can be paper, receipts, glasses, CDs, DVDs, computers, a lot of these type of equipments, breast milk. So if mother's exposed to BPA, she will pass this into her offspring through the breast milk. So it's not just something that they could be exposed in utero. They can actually be exposed in utero and then through breastfeeding as well. Then we also can get this in air, dust, and water. So really the exposure is universal, but a lot of this is going to be through food. And very similar to the vinclozolin, very similar to the dioxin, what you're going to get here is epigenetic modifications that is going to affect energy balance, fat storage, insulin sensitivity, insulin resistance, and it's going to affect appetite control as well. And again, same process. It is going to change epigenetics and take something that was once thought to not be inheritable and actually make it inheritable and transfer it across generational, creating a legacy across transgenerations in what's called transgenerational epigenetic inheritance. And that predisposes the offspring to obesity, increasing insulin resistance. So this is huge. And when you look at these three toxicants, they were all affecting epigenetic mechanisms, altering DNA methylation changes, histone modification, and non-coding RNA changes, and making genetics and the expression inheritable across the generation, affecting energy balance, fat storage, and inflammation, and creating a phenotype, that's the expression, the phenotype of obesogenic. And this is an inflammatory, overweight phenotype that you see that propagates disease. And so the concern here, if we're looking to make America healthy again, we have to look to a cause and really work to change the cause. And here we're talking about just three simple toxicants that probably every one of us would test positive to some degree and are being exposed to on a regular basis. But yet what they do is they change our genetic expression. It's the impact on us alone is a concern, but the impact to our kids, our grandkids, that's where the biggest issue is. You may say, well, I don't really worry about myself. Well, how about the impact on your kids? We talk about, the leaders of our country and the legacy of debt that they're passing on. Well, what's worse, a legacy of disease? Well, disease will create debt, so it just magnifies that legacy of death. But here it's creating this dysfunction, this metabolic dysfunction in many ways, inflammation that's promoting and increasing obesity. And we'll talk a little bit at the end of the podcast about the obesity epidemic in the U.S. and how that's just accelerating. And of course, that accelerates pathologies across multiple generations as well. So when we look at the impacts here of these three toxicants, vinclozolin, dioxin, and BPA, the first is metabolic disorders. It increases the risk and incidence of insulin resistance, type 2 diabetes, and metabolic syndrome. And really, when you look at those three, it's hard to unravel them because they're intertwined. I mean, diabetes, type 2 diabetes here we're talking about particularly is insulin resistance on a grand scale. And then metabolic syndrome is on a broader scale, insulin resistance. And these manifestations of metabolic dysfunction from these three toxicants are going to be a doorway into not just obesity, but here you're seeing type 2 diabetes and metabolic syndrome. And when you look at when you look at diabetes type 2 and metabolic syndrome, that's another door that takes you into cardiovascular disease, cancer, and name your chronic disease of aging right there. All through three toxicant exposure. And how many toxicants are out there? Thousands. How many of them bioaccumulate? Most. So the accelerated trend of these toxicants that we're being exposed to, they have to be addressed if we're going to make the citizens of America healthy again. Bobby Kennedy, take note. Reproductive disorders. There is a epidemic, that's not a strong enough word, but there is a travesty of infertility that's occurring in the United States today. And a lot of it is in men because of the low sperm count. I've written a couple books on low testosterone. Man Boob Nation was the first one, and the low sperm count. And these have been well documented for decades. This is not a new issue. The declining testosterone levels, interesting enough, vinclozolin blocks androgen receptors, which is not going to drop testosterone, but it's going to block signaling. And then a drop in sperm count. Men today are not the men their grandfathers or great-grandfathers were. If you look at that as a definition of testosterone or sperm count, that is indeed the case. But here we're not just talking about infertility in men, it's also impacting these three toxicants, infertility in women. But not just in the generation exposed. Again, it's taking the genetic expression, epigenetics, and transferring that across the generation to the offspring and impacting fertility in future generations. But it's not just about fertility. It's about hormonal imbalances and the metabolic issues that come from that. And also the related menstrual issues related to that, the surgery, the impact, the cost associated with management of all of that. Vinclozolin and BPA are really implicated here in the reproductive disorders because they're both endocrine disruptors, whereas the dioxin not necessarily is. It's more immune dysregulation, which getting into immune dysregulation is the third area, inflammatory disease. Here you're actually disrupting proper immune balance and you're promoting chronic inflammation. Now, let's look at this from a obesogenic or chronic inflammatory perspective related to aging. When you look as we age, what you see is a rise of disease, diabetes. Obesity, you could say, is a disease. Cardiovascular disease, cancer, autoimmune disease. What is this? The common thread between all of these is chronic inflammation. Not inflammation that is appropriate like a paper cut that prevents secondary infection and then recruits cells to promote healing. But here we're talking about just low-grade inflammation that just never turns off. And when you look at dioxin, what it does is it creates immune disruption, dysregulation, and this creates chronic inflammation, basically miscommunication with the immune system. And this is linked to autoimmune diseases. Hashimoto's thyroiditis, lupus, Sjogren's, so take your pick. That here, a toxicant can be causing immune dysregulation and actually causing autoimmune disease. Cancer susceptibility, of course, that is something, as I've mentioned, is what I deal with on a day-to-day basis. I work with the Williams Cancer Institute, love working with that team to innovate, elevate, and empower in the world of integrative oncology. But dioxin itself is a cancer-causing toxicant. And again, we have to move beyond concept of the dioxin exposure to the individual, intragenerational. But if it's a cancer-causing toxicant to the individual, to mom, to dad, then it becomes now, via the epigenetic transgenerational inheritance, it becomes a cancer-causing toxicant to their offspring for generations to come. Now, what's the impact? By modifying things like DNA methylation and histone acetylation, it's going to modify tumor suppressor genes. These are genes that eventually become proteins that suppress abnormal growth. It's going to turn those off. And then oncogenes, which stimulate growth irregularly and uncontrollably, it's going to turn those on. And so these epigenetic modifications are going to impact tumor suppressor genes and oncogenes. And this is going to increase cancer risk of the individual. Again, dioxin is a cancer-causing toxicant, but it's going to increase the individual of future generations. So imagine dioxin's exposed to mom and dad, creates metabolic dysfunction. They causes weight gain in mom and dad. Offspring comes along. They have an increased obesity trend versus mom and dad, but they also get the exposure of the carcinogenic toxicant dioxin. And now we see a compound and accelerating potential of how we can see these environmental toxins, our environment, accelerating our disease trend. And finally, neurological and behavior disorders. Here we're talking about the modifications of these three toxicants, increasing neurodevelopment disorders, behavioral disorders, and cognitive impairment in later generations. Especially look at this BPA, bisphenol A plastics. A lot of people look at autism and we're seeing this massive acceleration in autism. A lot of people want to point at vaccinations. And again, you have to look at what's in this. There are toxicants in the vaccinations. They are that way to stimulate an immune response. Not saying I like that. I'm just saying that's what's there. But what if the toxicants that mom and dad are exposed to epigenetically are transferred to their child? Then they go to the pediatrician, they get 20 vaccinations, and we get an impaired child that develops as a result of that because of the neurotoxicity, cognitive impairment, behavioral changes, neurodevelopment delay. Again, collecting the dots and then logically connecting the dots. But that's what this study shows. So the kind of pivot point here is obesity. Because that's what they were really looking at here, is the impact of these three toxicants on obesity. But I want to connect that dot moving forward, because the story does not begin with obesity. It actually really just takes on a different chapter. It becomes book 2, if you will. And there was a October 2024 study, so all the supporting evidence, the studies, etc., the show notes will be attached to this podcast and the video, and that'll be in the show notes. So I encourage you to read that, check it out for yourself, and share that. But there was an October 2024 study that suggested the link of excess weight or obesity in postmenopausal breast cancer has been significantly underestimated because of the use of the BMI, body mass index. It's an unreliable tool to try to evaluate overweight, obesity when looking broadly at the population. But let's look at the current definition using the BMI, though this study was saying it's underestimated, and that is true. Obesity, here this study looked at severe obesity. Obesity is going to be a BMI greater than 30. But severe obesity was a BMI greater than 40. And there was a new CDC report that actually came out in the U.S. showing that 1 in 10 adults were severely obese, a BMI greater than 40. And women dominated this. The actual percentage was a 7.7%. And this had increased to 9.7%. And that's where that 1 in 10 came from. So we saw this increase in severe obesity with the recent CDC report. 1 in 10. And again, women dominated. Toxicants, vinclozolin, dioxin, BPA, just a fraction of what is contributing to this obesity rate. Now, let's connect this dot now to cancer. There are cancers that are specifically related to obesity. Esophageal cancer, breast, colorectal, endometrial, gallbladder, stomach, liver, pancreas. Well, breast and endometrial, these are classically hormonal cancers. Vinclozolin, endocrine disruptor. BPA, endocrine disruptor. See how you connect these dots? So what's the cause? Well, this study looking at the obesity in 2024 was actually looking at the processed and ultra-processed food that had actually increased from 1800 to 2019. And it had increased from less than 5% to over 60% of foods that we're eating. Processed food. Toxicant. Now, you wouldn't think of it that way, but that's exactly what it is. Now, if I tell you BPA, you go, oh yeah, that's a toxicant. Dioxin, you bet that's a toxicant. DDT, bet toxicant. Vinclozolin, toxicant. Processed food, oh no, that just tastes good. No, it's a toxicant. So you see how the bioaccumulation can accelerate, and how if we want to actually make a pivot and make America healthy again, Bobby Kennedy, appreciate the work you're doing, by the way. We have to go back to the cause. We have to get away from policies that have allowed this. See, it's been government policies that have brought this forward to us. They've created the problem. And insanity is saying doing the same thing repeatedly, expecting different results is insanity. Well, I would say the same thing is if you let those who cause the problem, here, policy shifts by government, promoting carbohydrates, subsidizing processed foods, and basically creating a drug in the marketplace that's unregulated. And they created this problem. and then we go to them to solve the problem. I would say that is 1B of a definition of insanity. So what government's doing there with that is they're subsidizing behavior change. Now, when you look at the impact of government subsidy of behavior and behavior change, all we have to do is look back to the last pandemic of 2019, 2022, and still there's some residual lingering effect, if you will, bad taste in the mouth, bad odor. What's the obesity rate doing? Because the impact of what we did during the pandemic, it changed genetic expression as well. Well, looking at obesity rates of children ages 2 to 19, it increased from 19.3% to 22.4% in just a few years. The rate of the BMI almost doubled in children. And children are always a predictor of things to come. Adults, 42.4% obesity rates surged to close to 50%. And again, recent CDC showing that severe obesity was 1 in 10. So that's not just obese, that's severe obesity. And then, of course, here, the concern is the long-term impact on health and disease. Yes, the individual, intragenerational. But here we're talking about the impact transgenerationally. That is the collection of the dots of environmental toxins, vinclozolin, dioxin, BPA. And that's the connection of the dots to metabolic disruption, reproductive disruption, inflammatory immune dysfunction, disruption, cancer implications, and neurocognitive dysfunction and implications, obesity, and then to cancer. Hope this has been a joyful experience, but it's been an informative experience. Nobody likes to talk about the negatives of our environment, but being empowered, being informed is going to empower you to take control of your healing. To make America healthy again, we have to make each of you healthy again. And the best way to do that is not me as a doctor to treat you, but for me as a practitioner to empower you to heal yourself. Heal, physician, heal thyself. No, let's rephrase that. That was Hippocrates. Physician, heal thy patient. That is our goal. So I hope this has been informative to you. Thank you for joining this Prescribed by Dr. Nathan Goodyear podcast. If this has been valuable to you, I encourage you to subscribe to the podcast, download the podcast, share this with others that would benefit from this, family, friends, loved ones. And this can inspire them as it hopefully empowers you to gain a control of your healthcare. I encourage you to share, like, and subscribe this podcast. Drop us a 5-star review, and we will see you on the next Prescribed by Dr. Nathan Goodyear podcast. Thanks for joining us on this episode of the Prescribed Podcast. All references supporting this episode can be found on the prescribed.com website. That's pre-scribe.com. To get your next dose of medical innovation, make sure you subscribe to Prescribe. We'll see you for your next refill.